at least one other who's visited. Good. But it turns out that Elvis wasn't actually the inspiration for this song at all. South African musicians, the notion that life is a journey and that grace may be possible were in fact Paul Simon's inspirations. Enter our bold religious tradition of the universal love of God and salvation for all, and get ready right now. Sit back, enjoy, for a lot of backstory. For most of my life, from about 7 through college, which was a very long time ago, I was happily and deeply involved in a liberal Christian denomination, Congregational, which is now called the United Church of Christ, UCC, sometimes jokingly referred to as Unitarians considering Christianity. And my move to becoming a UU was not, therefore, an escape from an oppressive religious past, but a gentle evolution into a new, for me, more true and compatible religious tradition, a widening of the circle, if you like. But for the first 7 years of my life, I was raised Episcopalian, my mother's home church, which in the end was too ritualistic for my father, which is what propelled us to the Congregational denomination when I was about 7. Now, in my brief time as an Episcopalian, I went to Sunday school and learned songs like Jesus Loves Me, This I Know, and I completely believed and was utterly comforted by the absolute rock-bottom knowledge that God is love, and even more importantly, that God loves me as well as everyone in the world. God was and is love. I well and truly got it. So, as a somewhat precocious little kid and a very early reader, I was attempting to memorize the Nicene Creed, and I remember vividly discussing it with my mother, who was always trying to rationalize and make whole her deep and abiding faith in Christianity with her scientist self. I don't know how old I was, but I'm guessing 5 or 6, because it was before we began going to the Congregational church, which doesn't recite the Nicene Creed. So I'm learning it, and I come to the lines about Jesus being crucified, dead, and buried, and on the 3rd day he rose again from the dead, ascended into heaven, and sitteth on the right hand of God the Father Almighty, from whence he shall come to judge the quick and the dead. And all of a sudden I'm really confused and a little nervous. Mommy, what does it mean, God will judge the quick and the dead, I ask. Well, she says, and now from my adult vantage point, I can imagine she's thinking, why God? Why me? That I have to try to decipher this to a 6-year-old. But always game and never one to dismiss or treat lightly a real question from her kids, my mother tried to explain about heaven and hell. For me, and I really do remember this, it was a theological disaster. I wasn't buying any of it. Because it turns out I was and am a gut level, totally instinctive, completely sure of myself, universalist. Though, of course, I didn't know that at the time. I remember arguing with my mother for hours, it was probably minutes in fact, that if God is love, then he can't judge people into hell. No loving God or person or being of any sort could willingly condemn someone or something to live in the flames of hell for eternity. It wasn't possible. I even remember saying to her, if God equals love, he can't equal condemnation. Now, since I was 6 or so, I couldn't actually have said that. I hadn't learned about equations by then, and though I was an early and avid reader, not so much was I an early and avid mathematician. But in my mind, I made that connection, and it was as clear to me as the algebraic equation would be when I met up with them in high school almost a decade later. First, my mother, in response to my question, what if someone had never heard about Jesus? Would God condemn them to hellfire? Well, no, sweetie, God wouldn't do that. Well, then what if someone had heard about God but just didn't believe? How could God condemn them? I followed up, backing my question with the inexorable logic that if God is love, he couldn't do that. We came at this discussion from many angles, and in the end, my exhausted mother said, well, sweetie, I don't really believe God condemns people either. It has never made any sense to me. And I do know that God is love, so you are probably right. I went to bed that night feeling much better, and though I learned it, I never believed in the Nicene Creed. My cellular knowledge and belief in God's love gave me a powerful sense of security, comfort, protection, and joy as a child. It was, and continues to be, the basis of my faith in the possibility of human goodness, that force that encourages us all to act, sometimes even against our own interests, for the common good. But I left Christianity behind somewhere in young adulthood and didn't learn I was a Universalist until decades later, a couple of years after I joined Valley Unitarian Universalist congregation in Chandler. Though I left the trappings of Christianity behind, and even as a child, I never believed in the virgin birth, the physical resurrection of Christ, or walking on water. It was all unscientific and therefore not true. I always remained grateful for the powerful moral and political vision Christ's teachings gave me. Liberal Christianity provided the foundation of my politics. Feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, welcome the stranger. And yes, that means undocumented immigrants. Clothe the naked, visit the sick and those in prison. Minister to people. Above all, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And love your neighbor as yourself. Christ's teachings looked like democratic socialism to me and drew me into liberal politics. They still speak directly to both my heart and my mind. And then additionally, I appreciate Jesus' style and the way he is a role model of equality and nonviolent activism. As the Reverend Gregory Stewart declared in an Easter sermon at the First Unitarian Universalist Society of San Francisco, which I was lucky enough to hear, Jesus was a passionate lover, a glutton and a drunkard, who hung out with prostitutes, tax collectors, and sinners, who fought for equal rights for women, who visited prisoners, fed the hungry, clothed the naked, overthrew oppressive governments, treated children as equals, befriended society's outcasts, stopped paying taxes to the Roman government and Jewish religious leaders, and told others to think for themselves in matters of faith and practice. Simply put, Jesus was a party animal with principles. And wow, when you put it that way, who wouldn't want to turn to his teachings for guidance? Now, in this backstory, I'm 40, a politically liberal feminist activist, a former self-identified Christian, but one who never did believe in hell or most of what was unscientific in the Judeo-Christian lexicon, but who still regularly read the Bible for comfort and inspiration and never disavowed her religious upbringing. Indeed, I was a person who remained grateful for the moral grounding of my childhood religion still provided. And then on Thanksgiving weekend, 1985, my then 14-year-old son asked me to take him to church, whatever church I wanted, and I wandered into Valley Unitarian Universalist Church and was saved by the former heresies of Unitarianism, one God instead of three, and Universalism, the belief that everyone is saved by the love of God and that therefore there is no hell, except for what we make for ourselves here on earth. I say heresies because these two beliefs go back a long way in the early Christian church. Universalism, for instance, was the dominant school of Christian thought in Alexandria and much of the early Roman Empire until the 6th century, when the Emperor Justinian began consolidating power in Rome, as opposed to Istanbul, Constantinople, and sided with the Roman Catholic Christians led by St. Augustine, who emphasized original sin and believed God punished evil with eternal damnation in the flames of hell. By the Fifth Ecumenical Council in 1553, Universalism was condemned as a heresy, and the sin and hell folks prevailed, though Universalism still raised its loving head at varying times in the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, especially after the Protestant Reformation began. But even most branches of Protestantism bought into the idea of original sin and judging the quick and the dead into heaven or hell. Followers of Calvin, such as the Puritans who founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony, took it even further, believing God chose you to be elect before you were born, and that no good works could save you. You were either chosen or not. It was a cold and harsh Christianity, far from the notion that God is love. Nevertheless, Universalism began to seriously come back into heretical vogue in the 18th century, out of the Protestant sects of Anabaptism, Quakerism, and Methodism. though all saw it originally as somewhat heretical. James Relly, a Welsh former Methodist, preached universalism throughout Britain, and then actually he came to the United States as well. And it was from him and his followers that John Murray first came into contact with the universalist belief that hell was impossible since God was love. Sent by the famous Methodist evangelical George Whitefield to reclaim a young woman who had fallen under the sway of universalism, Murray instead found himself convinced by her. He became a universalist and ultimately was expelled from the Methodist Church for his belief in salvation for all. Several years later, financially devastated and heartbroken over the deaths of his child and his wife, Murray sailed to America, where he became the father of universalism here. Murray's universalism, with its passionate extolling of God's love, its egalitarian promise, and its promise that there was eternal salvation for all everywhere, quickly became a vital and thriving faith in America. It met with resistance, however, as Puritan churches expelled Universalist congregants. In fact, the first case for separation of church and state in America was a suit brought by a Universalist group against taxation to support a congregational church, which the Universalists won in 1774, 2 years before the Declaration of Independence. Universalism spread quickly up and down the eastern seaboard, and John Murray famously encouraged evangelism. Go out into the highways and byways of America, your new country. Give the people something of your new vision. You may possess only a small light, but uncover it. Let it shine. Use it in order to bring more light and understanding to the hearts and minds of men. Give them not hell, but hope and courage. Do not push them deeper into their theological despair, but preach the kindness and everlasting love of God. And his followers did just that. Universalism was a church of the heart and the good news of God's love, and it spread along the highways and byways of the new country like wildfire. The first association of the Universalist Church in America was formed in 1793, more than 30 years before the Unitarians organized in 1825. By the mid-19th century, Universalism was the sixth largest denomination in the United States. Its decline started in the early 20th century, when more Protestant denominations began to leave Calvinist precepts of damnation behind and accept modified Universalist doctrines into their theology. By the time of the unification of the Universalist and Unitarian denominations in 1961, 51 years ago, the Universalist Church in America was tiny, a fraction of the size of even the relatively small denomination of Unitarianism. But the extraordinary boldness of Universalism still thrills me today. It is a radically inclusive faith that replaces fear with love. It's the spirit behind our first principle to affirm and respect the inherent worth and dignity of all people. It is the basis of my congregation's mission statement that love is our doctrine, service is our prayer, and justice is our calling. In fact, VUU's mission statement is pure universalism. And the Standing on the Side of Love campaign, which is energizing the UUA nationally into social action issues on living wage, marriage equality, immigration reform, and countless other areas, is 21st century universalism put into daily practice, with love replacing fear and guiding our witness to our common humanity. The late beloved Dr. Forrest Church, in his last book, The Cathedral of the World, A Universalist Theology, which is a stunning collection of essays and sermons, calls universalism a religion for the 21st century. He uses the magnificent metaphor of the Cathedral of the World to illustrate his vision. Quote, a 21st century theology based on the concept of one light and many windows offers to its adherents both breadth and focus. Honoring multiple religious approaches, it only excludes the truth claims of absolutists who believe the light shines through their window only. Skeptics see the bewildering variety of windows and observe the folly of the worshippers and conclude there is no light. But the windows are not the light. They are where the light shines through. We shall never see the light directly, only as refracted through the windows of the cathedral. Prompting humility, life's mystery lies hidden. The light is veiled. Some people have trouble believing in a God who looks into any eyes but theirs. Others have trouble believing in a God they cannot see. But that none of us can look directly into God's eyes certainly doesn't mean that God isn't there, mysterious, unknowable, gazing into ours through the windows of the cathedral of the world. Church continues to remind us that, quote, universalism is an exacting gospel. Taken seriously, no theology is more challenging, morally, spiritually, or intellectually. It calls you to love your enemy as yourself, to view your tears in another's eyes, to respect and even embrace otherness. To truly love our enemies is almost impossible work, but Forest Church is right, I believe. It is the heart of universalism, and I would also argue that it is at the heart of all nonviolent social change. Gandhi called on his followers to love the British, and Martin Luther King beseeched his marchers to love Sheriff Bull Connor. And I would say it calls on us today in Phoenix to love Sheriff Joe Arpaio and countless others who we may not even want to love or even tolerate. Yes, it really does. We don't have to like them, but we do have to love them, because the core of all nonviolent civil disobedience is the universalist principle of respect for the worth and dignity of every person, anchored in the ineffable reality of God's love. Universalism is a wondrous theology that replaces fear with love, calls us to our better selves, is inherently egalitarian. And that's really important to me. If you really believe in the absolute dignity of every person, it is an inherently egalitarian religion and vision of the universe. And it demands us to try to model God's love here on earth. The work of universalism indeed needs doing and rewards us who try to do it in infinite ways, but it is not for the faint of heart. And as someone who tries to practice universalism daily, excuse me, I can say with certitude, it ain't easy, folks. I fail multiple times a day, I'm afraid, and I know I do. But I'm still trying, because universalism practiced can transform our lives and our world. In laying out his idea of a theology for the 21st century, Forest Church also says that, quote, it is impossible to speak of universalism without addressing the subject of God. And he counsels us that our understanding of God needs to be capacious, one of my actually favorite words in the English language, able to reflect the wonder and miracle of the universe. Humans are the only animals that know they are both born and will die. And Church posits that religion comes out of trying to understand that reality, that all of us experience birth and death. Religion is the human construct we make to guide our living in the time between our birth and our death. Calling on contemporary science, Church reminds us that, quote, we exist because the universe was pregnant with us when it was born. In miracle and in fact, our gestation begins to the beginning of time, traces to the beginning of time. In my experience, Church writes, only by positing the existence of a power beyond our comprehension can we begin to account for the miracle of being with an appropriate measure of humility and awe. In a later essay, Church gives us his definition of God, which works for me and may for you. Quote, for me, Church writes, God is the genius of the life force, that which is greater than all and yet present in each. Try as I will, I simply cannot explain or understand the miracle of life, and yes, of birth and death, in any other way. God is our name for the spirit that animates and impels and finally enfolds our lives into its own. Church goes on to say that you can be a Christian Universalist or a Buddhist Universalist or a Jewish Universalist, but you cannot be a Universalist Christian because the noun is universalist and the religious track is the modifier. To continue the metaphor of the cathedral of the world, the windows may be Christianity, humanism, Buddhism, atheism even, but the one light is universal. There are, as the song says, many windows, one light, and we can always see it, but only in its refracted way. To learn about universalism as an adult has been a great gift, and I am just beginning to learn the forms universalism has taken over the centuries. To have my innate gut knowledge of ultimate love affirmed as a religious path has made me able to claim God again, after years of saying I had no idea if there was a God, but I thought the question was really uninteresting. I actually do think it's still an uninteresting question. To have a vision of a universalist theology for our time has given me incredible joy, and I want to share the good news. But I also want to go back to the day I was driving along Discovery Bay and really heard Paul Simon's Graceland for the first time, with its incredible rhythms and its text that gives us a vision of universalism in the 21st century. Simon's metaphor, losing love is like a window in your heart. Everybody sees you're blown apart. Everybody feels the wind blow. Is such a striking view of the impact of loss of love, personal and communal, that it seems to me deeply theological. As true as John Donne's, no man is an island entire of itself. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never sent to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. I've watched friends be blown apart by the loss of love, and I've felt the wind blow, as I'm sure everyone in this congregation has. It's an icy wind, and faced alone it can freeze even the sturdiest soul. But the rock-solid universalists believe in God's love, and beloved communities of beloved people can help thaw that ice and make the wind much less forceful, like chaos theory's proverbial butterfly wings flapping in China, affecting the tornado across the world. When love is lost, it touches all of us, and we can see it, and we can feel it. God's love and grace, at its best often witnessed and bolstered by faith communities like West Valley, helps us through as we bounce, tumble, and fall all the way into Graceland. When Simon says, I may be obliged to defend every love, every ending, or maybe there's no obligations now, maybe I've reason to believe we will all be received in Graceland, we know he's right. The Universalist promise is just that. There are no obligations to defend love or endings. There is a profound obligation to try to do good and love your neighbor as yourself. But in the end, the promise is that everyone will be received in Graceland. So, as John Murray called us to do in the early 19th century, go out into the highways and byways and proclaim the bold and radical news of universalism, that God is love, and everyone is bouncing into Graceland. Blessed be. And now if you will all stand as you are able and sing 1014. We are standing on the side of love, and it's in honor of universalism, but also in honor of National Coming Out Day, which was on Friday and which is being celebrated this entire week. This song, written by Jason Sheldon, was written the day that Massachusetts was the first state in the Union to give marriage equality, to enact marriage equality. It's a really, really great song. Standing on the Side of Love, 1014.
It's
May this week bring you the comfort of love and the deep beauty of peace. Let us all now go out from this sanctuary knowing that we will do gently in the world what needs to be done. Go now in peace and just a little unrest. Oh, I don't know. You saw it.
Yes, let's read the unison reading in our order of service. We agree to provide a safe place to celebrate diversity, draw inspiration for living better lives, foster social and environmental justice, and compassionately support each other in our spiritual searches.